About 250 men are standing around a fueled intercontinental ballistic missile in the Kazakh desert, and the one man who could order them away is sitting on a bench 20 meters from it, watching. This is Site 41 at the Tyuratam range, on the evening of October 24, 1960. The rocket has been loaded since the day before. At 6:45, half an hour before launch, a technician resets a switch toward zero. About half the men at that pad never walked away. Every decision that put them there was signed off by someone competent. The rocket was 30 meters of thin steel standing on a concrete apron, and inside it were two propellants that catch fire the instant they touch each other. Red fuming nitric acid in one set of tanks, a hydrazine fuel in the other. They need no spark and no ignition system, because contact between them is the ignition system, and that is the whole reason the missile existed. The second stage engine lit while the vehicle was still on the ground, and the flame from it burned straight down through the tanks underneath, and what followed spread a lake of burning acid and fuel across the pad. The explosions went on for about 20 seconds. The fire burned for 2 hours. Men who ran for the perimeter found a security fence in the way. The fresh tar the crew had laid down days earlier softened under their boots and held them where they stood. Some jumped into the cable wells dug around the complex and suffocated on the fumes that settled into them. The man on the bench was Chief Marshal of Artillery Marshal Nedelin, and he commanded the entire Soviet strategic rocket force. There was nothing left of him to bury. They identified him by his Gold Star medal, which survived the fire lying on the concrete where he had been sitting. An engineer who arrived the following day spent 14 hours in a barracks trying to find his own brother among the dead. The chief designer of the guidance system was identified by his height because he had been taller than anyone else at the launch site, and the state announced that Nedelin had died in a plane crash and kept saying so for 29 years. Every version of this story I had heard treats it as recklessness or as proof of a system that did not care whether its people lived. The Commission's own findings say something worse than either. I want to walk through how those men ended up standing next to a fueled missile in the dark, because it is the most instructive engineering disaster I have ever read the paperwork on, and because the paperwork exists. The commission that investigated it wrote its findings down, and the file sat in an archive until Boris Chertok, who spent his whole career inside that program, published them with the Central Committee protocols attached. So this is not a story anyone has to reconstruct from rumor. The chain is on the record, and every link in it was pulled by somebody doing their job well. Now, the R-16 was not a moon rocket and it was not a satellite launcher. It was a weapon, and the reason it was standing on that pad already full goes back to what the Soviet Union had before it. By 1960, they had exactly one intercontinental ballistic missile that worked, and it was the R-7, the same machine that had put Sputnik into orbit 3 years earlier. The R-7 could lift satellites better than anything else on Earth, and it barely functioned as a weapon, and everyone who worked on it knew that. It burned liquid oxygen, which boils at 183 degrees below zero, so you cannot store it inside a missile and leave it there. You have to load it immediately before you fly, from insulated tanks, through a process that took most of a day. 20 hours of notice is 20 hours in which an enemy can destroy the thing on its pad while it fills, and the Soviet rocket force was defending a continent with a machine that needed a full working day of warning. So Mikhail Yangel's design bureau built something else. The R-16 used propellants that stay liquid at room temperature, so you could load it once and leave it standing ready for months. No cryogenics and no all-day countdown before anything could happen. Yangel's team promised a missile that could go in about an hour, and for a country that believed it was living under the guns of American bombers in Turkey and Britain, an hour instead of a day was the entire point of having a rocket force. That was a correct engineering answer to a real strategic problem, and every missile-armed nation on Earth eventually arrived at the same answer. It also meant the rocket armed itself the moment you filled it. Those propellants do not wait for a command, and they are corrosive enough to chew through their own plumbing. So from the instant the tanks were loaded, every seal and gasket in the vehicle was under chemical attack. A missile of this type could sit fueled for roughly 24 hours before the seals began to leak, and a leak on this machine did not make a cold puddle on the concrete. It made fire. So once the tanks were full, the crew was working against a deadline nobody on the range had set, and nobody could stop. Here is the chain, and each link gets its due before I tell you what it cost. It starts with the propellants, and I have already made the case for them. Storable propellants were the only route to a missile that could answer an attack, and there was no second option available. But the chemistry came with a bill, and that clock was the bill. The next link is one the whole world still remembers as a triumph. And the pride people feel about it does not usually arrive with the cost attached. 3 years earlier, the R-7 had launched Sputnik, and the Soviet Union discovered that a rocket was not only a weapon but a headline. Khrushchev was boasting publicly that his country was turning out missiles like sausages from a machine. The boast was mostly theater, because the deployable force behind it was thin, but it created an expectation, and expectations inside that system arrived with delivery dates attached. There was a tradition, a real and specific one, of timing the work so that the workers' gifts arrived for the state holidays. That autumn, the date in question was the 43rd anniversary of the October Revolution on November 7th. Nedelin and Yangel decided the first flight of the R-16 would happen before it. Hold on to that date, because the gap between the 7th of November and the day the R-16 actually flew is the entire measure of what this bought. It would be easy to make Nedelin the villain here, and it would be wrong. He was not a fool, and he was not a coward. He had commanded artillery through the war and built the strategic rocket force out of nothing. He was doing what the institution he served rewarded, on a schedule that institution understood, for a leadership that kept telephoning the range to ask when the rocket would fly. Khrushchev kept calling. The test team worked 72 hours without leaving the site, and the reason had nothing to do with the position of the stars. Therefore, on October 23rd, the rocket was fueled. The third link was not a decision at all, which is what makes it the cruelest one. At 23 minutes past 6 that evening, the night before the launch, the pyrotechnic discs in the propellant lines fired in the wrong order. These are one-shot barriers, small explosive membranes that blow open to let propellant through, and they work once. The plan called for the discs in the second stage oxidizer lines to go. Instead, the discs in the first stage fuel lines went, and minutes later the cutoff valve cartridges in a first-stage gas generator fired on their own. The commission traced it to design and production defects in the detonation control panel, built by a bureau called OKB 692. Nobody chose this. It was a latent fault in a piece of electronics, and it surfaced on the worst evening of the worst day, but the barriers were open. The 24-hour clock had started, and the missile could not be left standing while people thought it over. The last link was the decision to repair the electrical faults with the rocket full. Follow how reasonable that looks from the inside. The vehicle is fueled, the barriers are blown, the clock is running, and the launch is authorized. The alternative is to abandon the window entirely and start again. So the order went out, and men climbed the gantry and went into the compartments of a loaded missile to rework the wiring on a machine that would ignite if any two of its fluids met. Roughly 100 people were needed for that work. About 250 were there. A marshal was on the pad, and that pulls a crowd. And that is the link that killed them. The safety rules were not enforced, and they were not enforced because of who was sitting on the bench. Nedelin 20 meters from the rocket was a message, and a deliberate one. If the commander of the strategic rocket force sits in the open beside the vehicle, then the vehicle is safe, and the men working on it should stop worrying and finish. He was trying to steady them. The effect was that nobody could send anyone away. The range commander could not order the pad cleared, because clearing the pad meant telling his own superior to leave. Chertok's account is blunt about the atmosphere. Even in the smoking room, nobody dared to complain. The military testers who lived through it said afterward that they had never seen a violation of testing standards on that scale. The rules were perfectly well known. There was simply nobody present with the authority to invoke them against the man they applied to. I want to put the blame in the right place, because it does not sit on the pad, and it does not sit on the switch. On the evening of October 23rd, after the discs blew, the State Commission met to decide what to do with a fueled missile that now had a fault in its electrics and a day to live. And at that meeting, one man stood up and proposed the correct answer. He was a lieutenant colonel named Titov, a department chief at the firing range, and his proposal was to drain the propellant components, neutralize the missile at the range, and send it to the factory for modification. That was not a fantasy. Draining the rocket was possible, it was written down, and it had been done before. 3 months earlier, in July of 1960, a blowout disc had ruptured during preparation of the first R-14, and a leak had developed, and Yangel's own first deputy made that exact call. Drain the components, take the missile off the pad. The procedure existed. The men who knew how to run it were standing on that range. So the exit was open. Someone walked over and pointed at it, out loud, in front of the commission, on the record. He was overruled. Chertok, who knew every person in that room, wrote the verdict on it plainly. Draining the propellant would have been the only absolutely correct decision. And then he wrote the reason it did not happen, and it is 10 words. A lieutenant colonel had dared to disagree with the marshal, That is the moment. Not the switch, not the valve, not the fire. Everything after the evening of the 23rd is 100 competent people executing the consequences of a vote that had already gone the wrong way. Chemistry did not doom that rocket. It was doomed by a room in which the man with the correct answer had no standing to make it, and the man with the standing had a date to keep. I have read a lot of accident reports. Very few of them contain the right answer, spoken aloud, in time, by someone who was ignored over his rank. What happened over the following 24 hours was competent people working hard on a problem that should never have been theirs. Through the night and into the 24th, teams worked the electrical faults. The main current distributor had malfunctioned. The programming device, a mechanical sequencer that steps through the launch commands in order, had been left in the position it reaches after a launch because testing had driven it there. Before flight, it had to be returned to zero. There was a written procedure for that. The engineering plan required the sequencer to be set back to zero before the onboard batteries were connected. That order was not a formality. It existed because moving the sequencer with the batteries live meant the thing would be issuing real commands as it stepped through its positions. They connected the batteries first, at 6:45 the next evening, half an hour before the scheduled launch. With the pad crowded, the order was given to return the sequencer to zero. On its way there, it passed through a position that energized a pressurization valve on the second stage. Nothing about that component was designed to light an engine. It fed the start tanks, and that is all it did, and it was supposed to do it hundreds of kilometers up, in flight, as a backup. Instead, it did it on the ground. The second stage engine came alive, and its exhaust went down through the roof of the stage below it. The rocket was destroyed by a switch being returned to its starting position. There is film of the next 20 seconds, because the pad cameras were already rolling for the launch. You can watch men running away from a fireball that is expanding faster than they are. Yangel was not on the pad. Minutes before, a general had invited him and 2 other engineers to the smoking bunker, and the reason was not luck. They wanted to talk him into asking for one more delay. He survived because he had stepped away to argue for the thing Titov had already lost, and he never forgave himself for it. Leonid Brezhnev flew out to head the investigating commission. He told the staff at the range that they were not there to put anyone on trial, and by and large they did not, because the men who would have answered for the technical decisions and for safety were, with 2 exceptions, lying in the barracks being identified by their teeth and their medals. There was nobody left to punish. The commission wrote its findings, the file was sealed, and Nedelin got his plane crash, except one person was punished. At a meeting to discuss the findings, an engineer named Inna Doroshenko stood up and gave a technical defense of her hardware. She had developed the general electrical circuit. She pointed out that the blowout discs had never been through proper development testing, that a new procedure had been introduced during launch preparation to check them by sound, and that this was where the deaths had come from. On the technical merits, she had a real argument. The discs had not been properly tested, and the discs had failed. At the end of that meeting, an order was read out dismissing her from her job and barring her from working at defense enterprises for the rest of her life. Chertok, who was in the room, says the dismissal had nothing to do with an error in a circuit. She was punished for defending herself at the wrong moment, in front of people who needed the meeting to be finished. He compares her to the woman thrown overboard in a storm to save the ship. The commission that punished nobody destroyed exactly one career, and it belonged to the one person still arguing about the hardware. 5 reasons those men died. I am counting them out because the count is the only useful thing a disaster like this leaves behind. 1. The deadline. The launch was scheduled against the anniversary of the revolution rather than against the readiness of the hardware, and that inverted every judgment downstream of it. Nothing about the R-16 required a launch in October. A date in Moscow did. 2. The clock nobody chose. A latent defect in a control panel fired the wrong discs and started a 24-hour countdown that no one on that range had voted for. The fault killed nobody by itself. What it did was collapse the time available to think, and every link after it needed that collapse to be possible. 3. Rank as a safety system. This is the institutional one, and it is the stupidest. The range had the rule, and it had the man willing to invoke it. What it did not have was any mechanism by which a lieutenant colonel's engineering judgment could outrank a marshal's calendar. If your last line of defense is a junior man's willingness to be unpopular in front of his boss, then on the day the boss is in a hurry, you have no defense at all. That was the day. 4. A procedure that only worked in the right order. Zeroing the sequencer was safe before the batteries went on and lethal after, and the plan said so, and nobody on that range was ignorant of the plan. What the schedule did was compress 2 steps into whatever order the work happened to reach them in. Rushing does not usually make people skip a procedure. It makes them run the steps out of sequence, which looks like following it. 5. Everyone who could have stopped it was inside the blast radius. The commission, the chief designers, the range leadership, the man commanding the entire rocket force. All of them were at the pad, and all of them were killed or nearly killed. The authority had come to watch, which meant there was no authority anywhere else. A stop order has to come from somewhere outside the thing being stopped. And by 6:45, every man who could have given one was within 20 meters of it. Nobody in this story was incompetent, and nobody was malicious. Yangel built the correct missile for the strategic problem his country actually had, and the R-16 became the backbone of the Soviet deterrent for years. Nedelin was executing an institutional incentive the entire system ran on, and he stood in the most dangerous place on the range rather than watch from a bunker. Titov made the right technical call at the right moment. Doroshenko had the hardware pegged too. The range commander could not enforce a rule against his own superior, and I am genuinely not sure who inside that structure could have. Every one of them was doing the job in front of them, correctly, by the standards of the institution they were inside. Which brings me back to the 7th of November. The R-16 first flew successfully on February 2nd, 1961, 87 days after the holiday those men were racing. It entered service the following November, and it then served for years, exactly as designed. The gift was never delivered. The holiday came and went with no rocket in the air, and the R-16 flew when it was ready, which is what would have happened if nobody had died at all. Site 41 is still there. Baikonur launches to this day, and the pad was rebuilt and used for years afterward, and the strategic rocket force Nedelin built outlived the country that built it. But the men who were standing on that concrete are still not counted. The first figure the government gave in 1989 was 54. A state commission in 1994 said 78. The documented list of names runs to 92. Roscosmos, on the 50th anniversary, went with 126, which is where the half comes from, and then admitted in the same sentence that the real number is somewhere between 60 and 150 and cannot now be established. 66 years on, nobody can tell you how many men were on that pad when it went. And the reason nobody can tell you is that the people whose job it would have been to count them were standing on it. This is not for want of trying. The men who would have been counted were burned past recognition. The file that would have counted them stayed sealed for a generation. And by the time anyone was allowed to ask, the answer had stopped existing. 3 years later, on October 24, 1963, a spark in an oxygen-rich silo at Baikonur started a fire that killed 7 more men on the same date. There is a monument at Baikonur now, standing over a mass grave, and the names on it number 54. Every year on the 24th of October, flowers appear at the base of it. Nothing launches from Baikonur that day. Not the 24th of any other month, that one. Most of what I do here is take a file like this one apart and show you the chain inside it, because the chains almost always look like this. A run of decisions that each looked correct to the person making it, and a bill at the end that somebody else paid. Subscribe, and I will keep pulling them out of the archives.